presentation. So Lanny has led herb walks and nature hikes throughout Ventura and Santa Barbara and Los Angeles counties since 1976. He's educated hundreds of people on the local flora with a particular focus on herbs that can be used for food and medicine. He's also an herbal educator, and he leads workshops and other presentations on the edible and medicinal uses of California plants. As I mentioned, he just released his new book, A Field Guide to Common Healing Plants, Medicinal Herbs of California, and it's already in its second printing and received an honorable mention at the American Botanical Council for Excellence in Botanical Literature. So I think it's doing really well. Lanny earned his biology degree at UC Santa Cruz, and he completed a series of interdependent studies in naturopathic medicine under a variety of teachers, including the late herbalist William Lacerre and the late Chumash elder Juanita Centeno. So Lanny has co-led workshops and field classes and expeditions with Ms. Centeno, as well as noted experts as the late herbalist who you guys may know, Michael Moore. He's sort of one of the founding fathers of Western herbalism, and a variety of others, including our Chumash elder who we've had at the Native Plant Society before. That's Julie Chumaman Stensley, and also Patrick Chumaman. So in 2015, Lanny began offering plant classes through the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And that's a branch of the California State University Channel Islands through the Extended Ed program. So if you're interested in learning more from Lanny, there's lots of places where you can find him, and he's out and about giving classes and talks and walks. Lanny is also the founder of the Ojai Herbal Symposium. That's an annual event, I believe, and the Ojai Medicinal Cannabis Conference. He serves as a chief consultant on medicinal plants for the Swimmer Medicinal Garden, and that's located in Playa Vista. So last but not least, Lanny is a proud member of CMPS, Keep the Sespe Wild, Ojai Valley Land Conservancy, Ventura Land Trust, American Botanical Council, United Plant Savers, and a variety of other NGO organizations. So I feel like he's one of us and he gets it, and we're really lucky to have them. So Lanny lives in Ojai. He's a local person, and we can take advantage of having his knowledge and expertise in a variety of venues. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lanny, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you, CNPS Channel Islands members, for inviting me to speak tonight. Before I continue, how is my volume? I see some thumbs up. Okay, good. Well, we'll proceed then. Well, it is an honor and a privilege for me to speak to my own chapter of the California Native Plant Society, the Channel Islands chapter. I decided years ago that I wanted to be an advocate for our wild lands and for the plant communities to be found in them. And I realized that people take care of what they value. So I made it my mission to show that there is value in them dar hills, what the late Hewell Hauser would call California gold. Oh, wait a second, my slideshow is not progressing. What's happening here? We'll try that, okay. So this is my website, herbwalks.com. That's what the homepage looks like today. You can see I have a hike coming up tomorrow at the Ojai Meadows Preserve, which is our local wetlands, preserved thanks to the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy. And next Sunday, we're going up to Potrero John Creek, about 20 miles north of Ojai along Highway 33. And then on the 28th, I'm going to have to miss that great walk with Steve Junak because I'm leading a walk for the Ventura Land Trust at the Harmon Canyon Preserve. So that's the place, herbwalks.com, where you can see my events, join my email list, order my book, and access the many free resources that I have. In the resources page, you can see in the orange highlighted menu across the middle of the page there. And this is the book that Christy mentioned, and she also mentioned that it received honorable mention from the American Botanical Council for Excellence in Botanical Literature in the Consumer Popular category. And of course, I'm happy that the book is doing well and that the ABC appreciates the scholarship that went into it. But tonight, I want my fellow plant conservationists of the California Native Plant Society to appreciate it for another reason as well. As you noticed, I inserted the words environmentally sensitive in the title of tonight's presentation, words not found on the actual book cover. So before I give you a quick tour of some of the native plants in the book, I want to share with you what I believe makes my field guide environmentally sensitive. Here are the 6 ingredients that I used to try to accomplish that. The 5 criteria I used to select which plants would appear in the book: an opening chapter on sustainable collecting, an opening chapter on native plant conservation. I used the 4 conservation ranking systems to verify the status of each plant, including the CNPS inventory of rare and endangered plants. There's a conservation status section for each plant and a cultivation section for each plant. So let me break those down and illustrate each one of those 6 aspects of my ambitious goal to make this field guide environmentally sensitive. These are the 5 criteria that I used to decide which plants would even appear in the book. I began by applying the first 2 criteria to over 200 wild California plants that I selected as having known medicinal value. Is the plant common enough in California to justify small-scale sustainable collecting? And is a good part of the plant's range within California, or is California on the fringes? In other words, is it a better fit in a neighboring state's book on medicinal herbs? Because this book was intended to be the first in a national series of such books by Falcon Guides. Then that weeded out, to use an appropriate expression, that weeded out quite a few plants from my initial list of 200. And out of the remaining plants, I asked, is it a non-native weed so common throughout the United States that it is sufficiently covered in many other books? Dandelion, for example, is not in my book for that reason. Is there sufficient evidence of Native American medicinal use of the plant? And finally, is there sufficient modern scientific validation of its Native American uses? Because I found that there are many books that state this tribe used this plant for this, etc. And they all seem to repeat the same information. And I decided that it was my job to find out where that information came from, to dig deep into the sources within the tribes and the anthropological research to find that information. And then, most importantly, to validate that information with the growing body of scientific research into the properties, the medicinal properties of plants, a body of research that has been growing significantly in the last 20 years, although for reasons I do explain in the book, most of that research is happening outside the United States. But I hope that my book is part of a wave of interest in medicinal plants that will perhaps propel these plants back into their rightful place in the US pharmacopoeia. So through this process of applying these 5 criteria, I trimmed the list down from 200 plants to 70 plants. Then there's an opening chapter in the book on sustainable collecting. This information is my basic philosophy of sustainable collecting. It can also be found on my website in a blog post called Sustainable Collecting or Sustainable Foraging that is pinned to the homepage of my website. So it's always there. I don't expect you to try to read all that right now, but this is actually taken directly from the book here. And on my website, I have recently added to that blog the instructions for applying for a free U.S. Forest Service collection permit for personal use. And I recommend that anyone interested in collecting plants, once they have been able to make a positive identification of the plant and hopefully have applied the same kind of scrutiny to its conservation status that I have in my book, will then apply for one of these permits, because this is a way that the Forest Service can keep track of who is collecting which plants where and giving instructions on which plants are endangered, threatened, out of limits for collecting, which areas are not open to collecting, etc. So I do advocate that. And of course, I have my own permit. Another opening chapter in the book is on native plant conservation. And in this chapter, I describe the 4 organizations whose conservation status ranking systems I used in my book. And they are as follows: the International Union of, what does it stand for again? The International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. They have a well-known list called the Red List, and these are their categories. Wikipedia uses this system in their plant profiles, so you may be familiar with some of those acronyms for starting at the bottom: least concern, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, etc. So there are no plants in my book that are above the least concern category as far as the IUCN is concerned. The second status ranking system I used is our near and dear California Native Plant Society rare plant ranks, which I know that many of you are already familiar with, but they are outlined in my book. So beginning with the highest rank, or I guess you would call it the lowest rank if you're a fan of native plants, rare plant rank 1A, plants presumed to be extirpated in California and either rare or extinct elsewhere. And then it goes down to rank 4, which is a watch list. Now, in addition to these, 6 plant ranks, the California Native Plant Society also adds, after a decimal point, a threat rank to the initial numbers to show whether it's seriously threatened in California, moderately threatened, or not very threatened. The way I applied all these, you will see in a moment when I show you a sample page. The third ranking system I used is from the Nature Conservancy, and it's at their NatureServe website, and they have NatureServe global rankings and as well as individual state rankings for plants. So I decided it made the most sense just to access their state rankings for California. And so this is their ranking system from S1, critically imperiled, all the way down to SNR, which is unranked, or SNA, not applicable, which is used mainly for weeds and non-native species like wild oats. And finally, I accessed the UPS, United Plant Savers, Species at Risk list. And as explained in this page that you can see taken from the book, 2 plants from their list are included in the book. for their important status in the pharmacopoeia of medicinal herbs of California, but I include repeated warnings about their status and possible overharvesting. I will point out, though, that neither of those plants is on any of the other lists as far as being considered endangered or threatened. But because they are limited in their natural environment, their natural habitat to California, and white sage, for example, only grows between southern San Luis Obispo area and Baja California. Because of that, they are considered more threatened globally simply because they only exist in a small part of the globe. But in fact, there are still adequate populations of these plants in California, other than places where people can easily access them by car. That's where we're seeing the overharvesting of white sage, for example, that placed it on that at-risk list. So this is what a typical first page of a plant chapter would look like. And you'll see this is called the brief specs section for each plant. And then the page screenshot here starts into the little bit of the description, the text of the plant chapter. So you can see in the brief specs, I have the conservation status ranking. So for example, for white sage, the IUCN Red List, it's not listed. California Native Plant Society Rare Plant Rank, not listed. NatureServe State Rank, not listed. And it is on the United Plant Savers at-risk list. And so that's a brief summary of the information that's found in the rest of the chapter on that book. Now, within that, the text of that chapter, there's also a conservation status section, as there is for each plant in the book. And here you can see that I write, once abundant, white sage is now severely impacted by overharvesting and illegal collecting in areas accessible by car. It is on United Plant Savers species at risk list. Otherwise, populations are stable for now throughout its range, although the fragmentation of its habitat by human development is not a good sign for its future. By the way, parenthetically, that applies to all of our native plants. They're all threatened by our continuing encroachment into their natural habitats, as Christy pointed out, referencing Camp Roberts earlier. Please exercise the utmost respect if collecting this plant. Be vigilant about where you purchase it, and do not burn whole bundles for smudging. One leaf is usually enough. If you purchase white sage, ask the seller for proof of sustainable collecting or wholesale purchase from a farm. I haven't quite done it yet, but I may have made myself persona non grata at a couple of businesses that sell white sage bundles, because I have been questioning where they're getting their supplies. And this is I won't mention any names, but it's an ongoing issue that's been dragging on, trying to get the correct information from the suppliers. As you may be aware, this indigenous practice of smudging with white sage has gone international, and you can see it in commercials and rap videos. It's everywhere, and virtually all this supply is coming from somewhere in California, and most of it, unfortunately, is illegal. So you may be aware, as most of you are aware, of the Saging the World film that was recently co-produced by California Native Plant Society. Can I see any hands? Anyone that saw that or is aware of that? Okay, well, it's on the California Native Plant Society website, and they're going to have further screenings of Saging the World. And it really presents this kind of shocking story of what's happening. My personal opinion is that non-native people's interest in indigenous practices, spiritual practices, I don't think is a bad thing in and of itself. Personally, I think it's a good thing when people are seeking spiritual guidance, especially when it's found in nature. But it's the appropriation of this plant and improper collecting and improper excessive use that is creating a problem. But there are solutions. So that's why I decided to offer a photo of white sage to my publisher for them to decide if they wanted to use it as the cover photo, and that's the one they chose. So I went with their decision. And finally, each plant chapter has a cultivation section because I want to encourage individuals as well as growers, commercial growers, to grow these plants. And that's my belief. As the demand for plants like white sage grows, then the market will enter the picture, and native plant growers, farmers, horticulturalists will start growing more native plants for starts for gardens, or growing them to completion and putting them on the market as medicinal herbs, as people are already doing. For example, in Oregon, Oshala Farms grows lots of medicinal herbs. They're just one example. So it's a movement that's slowly growing, and that's my mission, to increase the sense of value about these plants, which then I think the solutions will come as people see that there is a profit to be made from properly making them available. All right, one last thing before we take a look at a few plants. My book is dedicated to my Chumash plant teacher, Juanita Centeno, and to all the indigenous healers and plant experts of California, past, present, and future. Not surprisingly, virtually everything we know about American plant medicine we learned from the indigenous people of North America. And this is Juanita Centeno, my Chumash plant teacher, whom I met in the early 70s, who became my friend and eventual collaborator when I began leading herb walks in 1976, and invited her to join me in Ojai for walks and workshops. Her photo is shown here in a permanent display case at the Lompoc Museum, where she lived most of her later life. And she's referenced throughout my book. One of the first things she taught me and her other students is to give thanks to the plants before we gather them. So in that spirit, I give thanks to you, Juanita Centeno. And now let's look at some plants. We have 5 true sages of the genus Salvia in the Ventura, Santa Barbara area. The 3 pictured here, purple sage, black sage, and white sage, can be found in sunny locations in the coastal sage scrub plant community and are featured in my book. The 4th, hummingbird sage, Salvia Spathosia, also in my book, is the only local salvia that prefers the shade of the riparian plant community. And the 5th, chia sage, Salvia columbarii, while also possessing medicinal benefits, is a better fit as a nutritional in Christopher Niergisch's companion falcon guide, Foraging California. The name salvia, the Latin name salvia, derives from the Latin salvus, meaning healthy, and salvere, meaning to cure. So we have other words related like salvation, salve, savior, all with the same root as sage. That tells us that sage has a long history in our Western European tradition for the medicinal use of the plant and the compounds found in its essential oil, used to treat a wide range of illnesses. The sage that you buy in the store and that is traditionally used, for example, in turkey stuffing, is European garden sage, which of course you can grow. In fact, my wife has some growing in the backyard. But we're very fortunate because we have the Mediterranean climate here in our area to have these 5 sages, 4 of which are found in my book for their medicinal properties. So here's a look at some young purple sage while it's still in its greener leaf stage. As you know, the leaves turn more of a grayish green as it matures. And this one, this purple sage, Salvia leucophila, leuco for white, phylla for leaf, so white leaf sage would be its technical accurate translation. This purple sage is the closest sage among our locals to European garden sage in flavor and appearance, consistency. It can be used as a substitute for cooking in the same ways that you would use European garden sage. And in addition to its culinary use, sage leaves of all species are incredibly useful medicinal herbs. They are antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, antifungal. They aid digestion, relieve cramps, reduce diarrhea, dry up phlegm, and fight colds. Pretty impressive list. Sage is also found in many herbal longevity formulas around the world, considered to be a plant that everyone should be ingesting just to maintain basic health and live a long and healthy life. Salvias, as you may know, are members of the mint family, which includes many of our popular European culinary herbs like thyme, basil, oregano, rosemary, marjoram, lavender, and of course the mints, peppermint and spearmint. And it's also, purple sage is one of our most beautiful and iconic spring wildflowers, and it is putting on quite a show right now. And I know that some of you have been out on the trails and seen it lately. It's really, it's having a spectacular year here in Ojai because we're 4 springs out from the big fire of December of 2017. And as you know, if you've been carousing in the hills yourself, our mountains are making a huge comeback right now. This is a great time to see the resilience of nature after a fire. And purple sage is really putting on a show. It attracts several species of native butterflies like the swallowtail and the variable checker spot, and native California bees like this bumblebee. Its close cousin is black sage. They are very similar in where they grow, in their growth patterns, the way they flower, but black sage, if you've ever rubbed up against it, has a much stronger terpene profile in its essential oil. Essential oils are where the medicine is in these aromatic plants, not necessarily the case in other plants, but in the aromatics, it's in the essential oil, which is made up of these compounds called terpenes. And in the case of black sage, it's some pretty strong smelling stuff. So it's more medicinal, but less suited for culinary use unless you know how to work with it and combine it properly. Otherwise, it will tend to overpower just about everything except maybe wild boar or venison. The black sage leaves are greener and the flowers are smaller and more bluish purple compared with the whitish green leaves of mature purple sage plants and the pinkish purple flowers of purple sage. Subtle differences. Also, you'll notice, oh, well, here, before I tell you what you'll notice, there's a European honeybee, and they are also non-native, as you may know, who is enjoying the nectar of this black sage flower. And you can see him going in and out of the flower like that. He thinks he's done, and then he realizes there's still some more nectar in there, so he's going in for another drink. You'll notice that, oh, and there's the sage honey that California is so famous for, and this jar here is bottled in my hometown of Ojai at the Heavenly Honey store. The black sage, while the leaves are still fresh and green, can be used to make a foot bath for chronic pain. Black sage contains 54 monoterpenoids, certain class of terpenes, in its essential oil that can penetrate the skin and inhibit pain receptors known as transient receptor potential cation channels. And my book cites a scientific study describing exactly how that works. So for any doctors or pharmacists in the group, I'll be happy to email you a link to that study. Or if you have my book, it's included among the 350 citations in the book. Something that my publisher immediately objected to, but they just said quite simply, oh, we don't put citations in field guides. And I said, well, you asked me to write a field guide for medicinal plants. I can't talk about the medicinal properties of the plants without showing where I'm getting the information. So they graciously relented on that and expanded the size of the book a little. And they allowed me to put in my 350 citations. But this brought up a pet peeve of mine, and maybe some of you have experienced that. If you're the kind of person that likes to look at the sources and then go look at the sources for yourself, it's kind of a pain to sit there with a book in front of you, in front of your computer, and try to transfer the 100 or 200 characters in a web address into a web browser. So I recently created a hyperlinked bibliography for the book, and you can find it at my website, herbwalks.com. It's also pinned to the homepage of the book. And I hope that will save you the inconvenience of having to do that manual transfer. So this recipe is in the book. It's also in Adams and Garcia's own book, Healing with Medicinal Plants of the West, another book I highly recommend. And there's the recipe right there. Now, here's what you will notice as you watch black sage through the summer. As soon as it starts to flower, and as soon as the flower heads start to dry, the leaves turn yellow. And the reason for that is it goes into summer dormancy. When we think of plants going dormant, we think of plants going dormant in the winter when it gets too cold. But in the case of sage and some of our other chaparral plants, that's how they survive these intensely hot and long summers. Once they finish making seed, they're done for the year. They just take a nap until the next rains come, whenever that is, and the leaves will turn yellow in the process as the seed heads dry. So here you see the yellowing leaves and the seed heads turning darker brown and drying, drying and drying. A little closer look. And there we have a close-up of the characteristic seed heads of this member of the mint family. They are whorls of flowers and then seeds around a square stem. And then when they dry, you can actually see the pockets there that the flowers were once in, which are now contain the seeds. And when they dry, the seeds just drop out on the ground for birds and other foragers to enjoy. And here are some in the palm of my hand. They are edible and high in protein and healthy fats, or they can be planted to propagate the species. Next up is white sage. This is what white sage looks like in the spring in its green stage before the leaves turn white. Although that is not the reason why it's called white sage. The reason is because the flowers are white. So purple sage has purple flowers, white sage has white flowers. Black sage does not have black flowers, so I don't know where it got its name, but you're welcome to chime in later at the question and answer time if you know the answer to that mystery. Why is it called black sage? And here is white sage at maturity as it appears on the book cover in this photo by Jess Starwood. As I mentioned earlier when discussing purple sage, white sage also is antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, antifungal, aids digestion, relieves cramps, reduces diarrhea, dries up phlegm, and fights colds, also inhibits perspiration and other secretions such as breast milk, among even more medicinal properties. It is considered the most medicinal of all of our sage species in California. And like all the sages, it's loved by pollinators. And here's another species of California native bumblebee going after some nectar there in the Salvia Opiana. Opiana from the same root as the word apiary, where bees are kept. So it's also known as bee sage. And thankfully for the white sage and for you gardeners, Salvia Opiana is in stock at this moment. No, actually they're closed now. They close at 5:30, but Salvia Opiana will be in stock tomorrow morning when you go to Green Thumb Nursery in Ventura, thanks to Green Thumb employee Richard Flowers, who took this photo just yesterday showing their current stock of white sage. Hummingbird sage. Oh, what a special sage this is. Unlike the other members, as I mentioned, of the sage genus here in California, this is the one that likes to grow in the shade. It'll grow in the sun, which happens sometimes when a tree falls in the forest and suddenly sunlight is streaming in. As long as there's enough moisture, the hummingbird sage will keep going. But really, nothing is known yet about the active constituents in hummingbird sage. And this is true, unfortunately, for many of the plants in my book. There just is not yet adequate study done. Many of the plants do have studies now, laboratory studies on their ingredients, not so for hummingbird sage yet, but they're lacking clinical studies on humans because those kinds of studies are very expensive. And since these plants are not in the US pharmacopoeia, it doesn't make much sense for a drug company to spend the millions and millions of dollars it takes to bring a drug to market, something that I hope my book will contribute to remedying. But since we do know about the chemistry of many other sages of this Salvia genus, we can assume that a sage as aromatic and resinous as hummingbird sage has an abundant supply of terpenes, resins, and flavonoids, known collectively for their antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, and anti-anxiety properties. So hummingbird sage is used as an anti-anxiety tea. And there's a great recipe in my book that I got from Cecilia Garcia and Jim Adams for a tea made with Mexican chocolate and hummingbird sage. It is possibly the most delicious tea you will ever try. I recommend it. And in addition to that particular tea, a tea of hummingbird sage leaves can be used as a decongestant expectorant for colds to help stimulate secretions, to cough up phlegm, and it's antimicrobial, so it's gargled and drunk for sore throats. Because the flowers are so long and narrow, hummingbirds are virtually the only pollinator that can actually get in there to get to the nectar and serve as a pollinator for this plant, and hence the common name hummingbird sage. The Latin name comes from the shape of the leaves, which are, well, hard to get a good look at them at these photos, but they're the shape of a pie server spatula. And Spathosia comes from the same root as the word spatula, so spatula-shaped leaves. The old Latin names that I love so much told you something about the plants. We live in a different age now of individual glory, when plants are most often named for a botanist or a friend of the botanist or someone else, some high-ranking person. So you get a lot of names attached to plants that tell you nothing about the plant except that, it was named for so-and-so, Mr. Douglas or whomever. Not to, belittle those great botanists and people, but I like the names that tell you something about the plants. Okay, I'm going to wrap up the rest of my discussion here, this virtual herb walk, as it were, by looking at 3 local native plants that I believe deserve to be studied as possible treatments for COVID-19, the novel coronavirus, because they have all 3 demonstrated ability to treat the common cold, which is also a coronavirus, and the common annual influenza virus. So let's look at these 3. First, blue elderberry. Elderberry fruits and flowers are rich in sugars, fiber, protein, including 6 essential amino acids, vitamin C, minerals, including potassium, calcium, iron, and many others. And as you probably know, because it's gotten so much publicity and has been around for so long, elderberry flower tea and elderberry fruit syrup, wine, etc., to treat common colds and flus are ancient practices that have been practiced around the world. And blue elderberry is literally found around the globe in the Northern Hemisphere, and interestingly considered native wherever it's found. But that's another subject for another time when you come on an herb walk and we look at some elderberry, and I'll tell you all about that. And elderberry has gotten a lot of publicity in recent years. I don't think there's anybody in this group that's not aware of that elderberry is being used as a medicinal. The reason is there's a protein in elderberry flowers that can bind directly to the common flu virus and neutralize a viral protein called influenza hemagglutinin that helps the virus attach to lung cells. And it's, that has to do with these spikes that you see around the virus. The virus uses compounds that it creates to invade cells, and elderberry is able to block that, neutralize that protein that the influenza virus uses. The fruits contain compounds called flavonoids that are actually pigments that can block the virus from attaching to the immune system cells in our lungs, the dendritic cells, and that allows those protective cells to do their job of activating the immune system. These elderberry preparations are best used at the first sign of sickness, and that goes for all of these herbal remedies. And several studies have shown that elderberry flowers, fruits, and products like this, Sambucol, a cold and flu product from Israel, can affect the onset, duration, and severity of colds and flus. And those studies are all among the 350 citations in my book. Secondly, California everlasting, sometimes called green everlasting. It's a native plant, formerly of the genus Nephallium, before the botanists got hold of DNA research and revamped the taxonomy. So now it doesn't get its own name anymore. Now it's Pseudonythalium, fake Nephallium. How's that for a downgrade for California everlasting? But it's also known for its anti-inflammatory and astringent activity in treating the inflamed mucous membranes of respiratory conditions. And it starts out looking like this, and it's a fire follower. So there's been a great amount of it since our fires. It's an annual, sometimes grows 2 years, so it can be a biennial. And then in the spring, the flowers start to blossom. Actually, right about now is when they're starting to blossom. So late spring, early summer. And they have this wonderful perfumey aroma that people describe as either maple syrup, oranges, butterscotch, curry, or some combination of all those scents. So you probably smelled it before you spotted it on the trail, if you've been out on the trail since the fires. This is what the mature flowers look like. And you can see that there's one opening up over on the left side. It's in the the aster family, Asteraceae. So it has disc flowers in the middle and ray flowers around the outside. And just at the point that the yellow disc flowers are just starting to show yellow, excuse me, in the center of the flower is when they are harvested. Again, the phytochemistry of California everlasting has not been studied, but many other Pseudonythalium and Nyphalium species have been researched, and they contain anti-inflammatory flavonoids. So there's no reason to think that some or not, or all of these aren't also found in our California everlasting. And several of these flavonoid pigments are called neuraminidase inhibitors. What that means is viruses have an enzyme called neuraminidase that they use to dissolve the membranes of our cells to invade the cells. These flavonoids in everlasting flowers are neuraminidase inhibitors, so they can block viral neuraminidase. They also contain anthocyanins, other flavonoid pigments that can stimulate the immune system as well. And here we see the dried everlasting flowers. You can see a couple still showing some green, but for the most part, these are now sun-dried on the plant. And you've probably seen these in dry flower arrangements. They're known as straw flowers in that setting. And they're, they contain, you can tell from the aroma that they're also aromatic. And so they have terpenes as well with antimicrobial and pain relieving properties. Some species of Nyphalium have inhibited Streptococcus and Staphylococcus bacteria in the laboratory. And so again, that's why it made it onto my short list of 3 plants that deserve further study as possible COVID treatments. And the last is Urbasanta. Here in Ojai, we have a lot of Eriodictian crassifolium, which is also known as thick-leaved Urbasanta. And the Chumash and other California tribes have been known to use this plant for lung problems, including asthma, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. Bacterial pneumonia was here before Europeans arrived and was probably a constant concern, especially for children. Plants of the genus Eriodictian have many flavonoids in them, there's that word again, including eriodictyol and homoeriodictyol. And California Urbasanta, Eriodictian californicum, was formerly listed in the US Pharmacopoeia. It made it to the book that doctors have to use to prescribe medicines. And then it was demoted from there to the National Formulary, meaning that it could still be included in medicinal preparations, but it was no longer considered to be medicinal by the Pharmacopoeia for use in bronchitis. And then it was finally removed in 1960 when new laws required that the efficacy had to be demonstrated with clinical studies, which virtually none of these plants have because of a history I explain in my book in a chapter called A Brief History of Medicinal Herbs in America. There's my wife, Rondia, enjoying the Urbasanta on the Potrero John Trail, where we're going next Sunday. Jan Timbrook, in her book, Chumash Ethnobotany, describes the Chumash boiling the leaves of Urbasanta and drinking the tea for colds, chest pain, coughs, and fevers. And the famed herbalist and author, Michael Moore, considers it an expectorant, helping remove phlegm from the lungs, as well as a bronchial dilator, useful in chest colds, bronchitis, asthma, and hay fever. And it's resinous. It has a powerful array of flavonoids. And the two I mentioned, Aerodictyol and Homo eryodictyol, are cited in a 2020 study that looked at, I think, about 80 different compounds with potential for treating COVID-19. And Aerodictyol found in Urbasanta was number 4 on the list. So this plant certainly deserves to be at the top of the list of natural substances being researched for treatments for COVID-19. It's also loved by pollinators, especially the swallowtail butterflies. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions. That's what my book looks like. You can purchase it on my website, which I prefer, or I now have it in 14 different outlets, businesses like Bart's Books, Emma's Herbs in Ventura. I have 14 places now carrying my book in Ventura, Ojai, and Santa Barbara, as well as hopefully other fine bookstores in California. So thank you very much for having me, and I guess we can turn on the mics and take some questions.
Okay, before we do that, I know it's virtual, but let's give Lanny a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. I can see your hands, virtual and otherwise. Thank you.
Okay, so you have your choice, folks. If you have questions for Lanny, you can turn your camera on and go ahead and ask them verbally. Otherwise, I'll take questions in the chat. So whatever you're interested in, let's go ahead and ask a few questions for the time we have remaining.
Anybody?
Did I just cover everything so exhaustively that, or else I bored everyone to sleep? I mean, I did see a few people trying to hide their yawns.
Okay, we have a hand. It's Richard Rackman. I hope I said that right.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. Hi, great talk. I guess my question's about, I know this is a native plant group, but maybe mentionable invasive species that you think we should be, considering or investigating more that are around Los Angeles?
Absolutely. In fact, I did not limit my book to native plants. In fact, I prefer that people harvest the non-natives, eat the weeds, make tea from the weeds. So let's see, some that I can think of offhand. I know wild oats is in my book. Now it's just now past the point of harvesting for medicine. You do that when it's still in the green milky stage, but you still can find some like in the shade of an oak tree or somewhere that hasn't turned yellow yet. If it's still green and you can extricate one of the seeds and squeeze it and the white milk comes out, that's oat milk, by the way, the real thing. Then it's still at the stage that it can be used to help nourish the nervous system. It's used especially for people that have been through any kind of condition, trauma, etc., that has taxed the nervous system, and it rebuilds and nourishes the nervous system, and can also be used as a calming herb as a tincture. I don't want to get into too much detail about it. So wild oats. I have a particularly noxious weed on my list, which is goat head, also called puncture vine, that everybody would like to see removed from bike trails, preserves, you name it. Everybody wants it out of there. In fact, a weevil was introduced into California around 1960, and it got rid of about 95% of the goat weed, but there's still some there. So it has value that's been shown in other countries as a kind of a plant sterol for helping our bodies to create our own steroids, natural steroids. So it has various uses for mostly the glandular system. And another non-native in my book is eucalyptus. As much as it steals water from native plants, which is, by the way, the main reason it was planted in the first place by ranchers and growers. They planted it in swampy areas to soak up the water and get rid of the swamps, which it did a great job of. But it also then continues to steal the water from everything around. Plus it has toxic litter. But that being said, eucalyptus oil is internationally known as an antiseptic, naturally antimicrobial oil. And the tea of young Yerba, young eucalyptus leaves can be used as a tea for colds, as an expectorant, but also as an herbal steam inhalation to just inhale the steam from a pot of eucalyptus tea. So those are three right there. And I know there are others in the book.
You have to say fennel too, really quickly, because I want.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and fennel. Yes, wild fennel is in the book. So wild fennel is the wild species. There is also a cultivated species, sweet fennel. That's the one that's sold as a cultivar for fennel root, they call it. It's really a bulb at the base of the plant, which is, what gives licorice its flavor. Black licorice candy is flavored with anise oil, and anise and fennel have virtually the same aroma. So the wild fennel is not as sweet, but it definitely has that licoricey flavor. And it's used as a digestive herb, something that you would drink after a meal to promote digestion. Some herbs are drunk before a meal to stimulate gastric secretions and help get the digestive system going, but this is one that's used after a meal. Hi, David. Oh, just a second. Which is why you'll see bowls of fennel seeds in Indian restaurants, East Indian restaurants, as you leave, as a breath freshener, because it is antibacterial, but also to aid in digestion. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Christy. I see David's hand is up. Good to see you there, David.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Great presentation.
Thank
Tell
you.
us
Glad you
about
made it.
Silybum marianum, milk thistle. a
Yes.
non-native.
Milk thistle is not in my book because, as I explained at the beginning, one of my criteria was not to include herbs that are so ubiquitous across the continental United States and beyond that they are covered in so many books. And I just decided that that was one that wasn't going to make the cut. It was a very difficult process, and I spent a long time at the beginning of writing the book paring down my list of 200 plants down to the 70 that the publishers wanted. And that one didn't make the cut for that reason.
I see.
Okay, we do have a couple questions in the chat. The first one is coming from Pat, and it says, what part of the Pseudonythalium is used and how?
Okay, the main medicinal part for tea is the flowers. And they have to be harvested at just the right time, which I explain in the book. There are details to these things. Some plants are more forgiving than others, but the Pseudonythalium, the California everlasting, if you pick the plants too green, if the flowers too green before they open up, when they look like pearls, and some people call it pearly everlasting, which is actually a cousin, not the same plant, they're a little bitter in the tea. If you wait too long, then they start to give up their aromatic properties to the sun. They just simply, the terpenes are evaporating in the sun. But you're probably better off picking it a little on the late side than picking it when it's still green, when the flowers still have some green in them. And that's the tea that's drunk for colds and flus. And as I mentioned, it deserves study as a COVID-19 treatment. Now, the leaves are also what's called a styptic, meaning they stop blood flow externally. So you can, like for trailside first aid, if you got a scrape, for example, on your knee or your elbow, you could apply fresh everlasting leaves to it, and they will stick right to the skin, just naturally, like a Band-Aid, because they're so sticky, and they will stop the bleeding. And they also have pain relieving and antibacterial properties as well. So that's, I'm sure my wife, the RN, might not approve of that particular type of first aid, but that's old-fashioned trailside first aid right there. I hope that answered your question, Pat.
Okay, that sounds great. And then we have one more that says, do you have a recipe for the Urbasanta, or what part do you use?
Okay, good question. Yes, on the Urbasanta, you use the leaves. And the stickier leaves, the better. So I wait with Urbasanta until the middle of the summer. And I go out on when the weather's been sunny, and I can squeeze a leaf and it sticks to my fingers. And that, at least that's true of the crassifolium species, which I find the more resinous species are the best ones to use. So the rule of thumb for most aromatic leaves is you don't boil them, unless you want to like use it as a deodorizer for your room. But if you want the compounds to stay in the tea, then the rule of thumb for leaves and flowers is you don't boil them. But the exception to the rule is Yerba Santa, because the oil is found in a resin. So it is crystallized inside the leaves, and it has to either be steeped for a very long time, or I think it's better to put it in cold water, bring it to a boil, just to a boil, and then turn it down to a simmer and simmer it for about 5 minutes. Then let it steep after that for another 10 or 15 minutes. Then you can lift the lid. You do this in a pot, a glass or stainless steel pot. Then you can lift the lid, put your head over the steam, put a towel over your head, and inhale the steam. And this, as the studies in the book show, this has the potential to treat some serious lung conditions, also working as an expectorant to bring the phlegm up out of the lungs. And yes, there are recipes in the book for how to do that with Yerba Santa.
Two more questions in the queue. I'm going to go ahead and take Ray first. His hand is up. Go ahead, Ray.
Thank you. I wanted to know, you said don't boil the leaves. Is there an optimal temperature?
Well, so for, I said that was the rule of thumb for aromatic leaves and flowers. So what you do is you just boil the water separately, and then you pour the water over the herb in a teapot or in a cup, and put a saucer over it, and you steep it. And that's called an infusion.
Okay.
When you boil an herb, that's called a decoction. So you don't decoct most leaves and flowers, you infuse them by that method. Did that answer your question?
I think so. So similar to black tea as opposed to, say, green tea.
Well, I make an infusion of both of those. I'm not sure what is your distinction? Do you treat those differently when you make tea?
Yes, I use water at 175 degrees for green tea.
Okay.
Boiling 212 degrees for black tea.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that sounds good. It doesn't have to be, the water doesn't have to be like 212 degrees full boil. to extract the properties from most plants.
Thank you.
We have one more in the chat from Sheila, and she's asking if laurel sumac has been used medicinally, and I think she's talking about the Meloesma laurina.
She is, yes, that's laurel sumac. So a member of the sumac family, which includes poison oak, most notoriously, but also includes our wonderful three-leaf sumac, the Rhus genus. Rhus aromatica it is now. I'm still trying to keep up with all the changes in the names. By the way, I use the Jepson E Flora as my guide. You have to go somewhere and that's what I stick with. So there's the Rhus aromatica, then we have the sugar bush, Rhus ovata, and lemonade berry, Rhus integrifolia, that you folks in Santa Barbara and Ventura find more often closer to the coast. We have more of the basket bush, the three-leaf sumac, or the Rhus aromatica up here in Ojai, and then in between you'll find the Rhus ovata. So those have wonderful berries. The Meloesma laurina used to be Rhus laurina. Now it's got its own genus, and it is different from the others. It doesn't make berries like the others. I have not yet found a part of it that I found useful. Historically, it was used in smoking mixtures by native people. So if you want to make your own herbal tobacco, you might try that. But bear in mind, there are some allergenic plants in the sumac family. Obviously, poison oak, but also pistachios, cashews, and mangoes are also in that family, and the Peruvian pepper trees that we have around here. So if you're sensitive to any of those, you probably should stay away from it. And finally, what I wanted to say about Meloesma laurina is that the sap of that plant can give you a poison oak rash. And I have not gotten that rash because I've been careful around it. But if you break a branch, or mostly people get the rash from pruning it and not realizing that the sap is just as potent as the urushiol in the poison oak oil in the poison oak leaves. So something to be aware of with that plant.
Okay, friends, we'll give one last call for questions. Going once, going twice. And we'll close the questions. I put Lanny's website in the chat in case anybody missed the beginning. And that's where you can find all of his events and his walks and his talks. So I think we had a great turnout. And again, many thanks to Lanny for giving us a great presentation. And please go out and purchase his book, where you can have more of your questions answered immediately in the palm of your hand. Right, Lanny?
Or come on an herb walk and ask your questions. I thrive on questions on the walks, and I love teaching out in nature with the plants right there, because my belief is nature is the teacher. I am the guide leading people into nature, but the nature is the teacher. And I'll explain that more on the trail.
And clearly he's a wealth of information, so no doubt about that.
Well, thank you again for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, everyone, have a great night. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Much.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye,
Good night, everybody.